Good day, reefers. Today it's gonna be all about the CO2 regulator for your calcium reactor. Welcome to JzReefz, where reefing's made easy. As some of you might know, I've been looking for a calcium reactor, pondering over it for quite some time because of the science and difficulty and learning curve that I have to go through, which deterred me from embarking on this journey. Since then, I've decided to proceed with a calcium reactor due to the high consumption of alkalinity in my tank. So I'm gonna share my journey with you so you don't have to go through the tons of reading that I have to go through. So in today's video, I'm gonna go through firstly what is a CO2 regulator, followed by the setup of the Co2 Art CO2 regulator over here, and followed by some tips and tricks and possibly how you can save money for your CO2 regulator. With me over here is a JBJ CO2 regulator that I have found in one of my cupboards hidden somewhere. Nevertheless, here are the parts that comprises of a current modern CO2 regulator. It comprises of a solenoid over here, which is actually controlled by power. So the moment you switch on the power, it's gonna pull up a magnet and allow CO2 to flow through from the input over here, which is connected to your CO2 tank, and it's gonna show you the input pressure of your CO2 tank, which also tells you when it is time for a refill, and also the output pressure of your CO2 line. When the CO2 actually goes out, it actually connects to what we call a bubble counter, which we normally fill it up with RODI water, and you can see the bubble start going through the water before connecting a hose to your aquarium. And this in general is where we count the bubbles when connecting the output to your calcium reactor. For a CO2 regulator, there are actually two versions of it regardless of how many gauges you see here. So please do not be confused. I've went through the hassle of reading it up so that you don't have to. Despite having two gauges over here, which is why I'm using this as an example, this is actually a single stage CO2 regulator. What I meant by it only allows you to connect to your CO2 tank and control the output. There is no control of the pressure of the CO2 that travels towards your calcium reactor or your atomizer or your diffuser in case you are a freshwater hobbyist. So what I meant by a dual stage CO2 regulator, essentially when you connect to your CO2 tank, not only it shows you the pressure of the tank, it also shares with you the pressure of the output, and there should be a knob that allows you to control the pressure output that travels to the bubble counter or to your diffuser or your current setup, which you can further control it again by the needle valve. So this needle valve, you can actually rotate it and control, and it's available be it on a single stage and dual stage regulator. The only difference is you get to control the output of the CO2 pressure. Why do we opt for a dual stage instead of a single stage in my case? Well, I've read across a lot of freshwater aquarium hobbies forum. So they shared that for a single stage regulator, you will not be able to control the pressure because it is so low, and it will be just letting the remaining of your CO2 in your low pressure CO2 tank go through and dump into your tank, and that is what the hobbyists also coin it as a low pressure end tank dump. So why did I choose the CO2 Art regulator? Firstly, it's a dual stage regulator where you can actually control the output over here, and it supports up to 40 psi, so that is more than sufficient for my calcium reactor. And in the event that I would want to wish to connect it to a freshwater aquarium setup using the same CO2 tank, this baby over here will live up to the performance that I need. It comes with an integrated check valve on the bubble counter itself, so I do not need to install a separate check valve to prevent any backflow. And the awesome thing, 5 years warranty. Now if you have multiple tanks and you require more than 40 psi, do check out their Elite series because it supports up to 80 psi, which is a lot if you just need about 10 to 20 psi per tank as mentioned earlier, and it comes with a crazy 10 years warranty. With that being said, let's unbox this regulator, go through the setup and see what it is made of. Here's a quick overview of the exterior box. So you can see here is a 12 volt DC solenoid and the support page and the user manual, if you require the user manual, that is. And down here it says the same thing. Reduce the high pressure, so that's why we want the dual stage, which we can adjust. Inside here we have the Buffy, and I mean this guy is hefty, very strong rigid build. The 12 volt solenoid, the bubble counter, the 2 gauges. This gauge will be for your CO2 tank, which you connect over here, and this will be the adjustable pressure, which you can adjust over here, followed by spare O-rings for your connection to your CO2 tank. We have a QR code to activate the warranty, a box of accessories which just contain the power adapter, along with a huge array of plugs. And there you have it. This is an overview of the items you will get when you order the CO2 Art regulator. Now let's move on to the setup. For the setup purpose, what you will need is an adjustable wrench, or spanner if you have the right size, some RODI water for the bubble counter, a way to pour the RODI water into your bubble counter. For my case, I'm using this draw syringe. If you do not have this, feel free to use those syringe that's provided with your aquarium test kits. Just give it a good rinse and you can draw RODI water with this and just inject it into the bubble counter. Prior to the setup, ensure that your CO2 tank is filled up and closed tightly so that there's no air leakage. We will install the regulator using the O-ring and the regulator like so. And we start with a hand tightening installation first before we do a tightening using the wrench. Now that it's all tight, we have to ensure all the valves are closed. In this will be clockwise for closing. We also have to ensure the valves are all closed and it's not connected to any power over here. And next we gently open the CO2 cylinder, and you should see the pressure gauge increasing. Similarly, if you were to tweak with the output, you should see the other gauge increasing also. After connecting the power adapter, I managed to get it running and figure out the gist of it, so I'm going to share with you guys. So firstly, this is the pressure gauge for the CO2 tank that we have here. Next, this is the output pressure of the CO2 that goes into the bubble counter, which I set it to around 1 bubble count per second. So if you see the gauge over here, if you were to turn it clockwise, it actually increases the pressure over here, which forces more pressure and air bubble to be released. So if I were to set it at a fixed pressure of 10 psi as per recommended, I still can adjust it further from the needle valve over here as seen. Now to the pros of this CO2 regulator. I love that it's built like a bomb, very sturdy fixture, and the tuning was buttery smooth, believe it or not. For this regulator, by dialing in the PSI of the output or the pressure of the output over here, it basically controls to a very defined level, and minor adjustment over here with the needle valve just allows the simple tuning that a calcium reactor needs without sacrificing the accuracy that we all appreciate over here with this CO2 regulator. For the cons of it, I couldn't really find any fault with it because it is so simple to set up and the tuning was so easy for me compared to a lot of other regulators that I've used in the past. If I were to really find fault with it, would be it actually extends quite a fair bit out, as you can see here. So please bear that in mind when you are installing the CO2 tank along with the regulator, and find the right spot to cater for the space that's needed based on the width of this CO2 regulator. Some tips I would like to run through with you guys during the setup. Firstly, let's try not to over tighten this joint over here because it might eventually ruin the O-ring. Just tighten it to have a snug fit. If you hear some hissing noise, it means that CO2 gases are releasing or escaping from here. So what you can do to remedy this is to quickly close the valve of your CO2 tank and tighten. The next point I'm going to share with you, after you set it up, you can actually use a spray bottle, mix in a bit of detergent and spray across all joints. If there's any bubbling coming out from the joints, it means that there's very little gases escaping through the joints, so feel free to tighten them. Aside from the steps that was just mentioned, you can do what I'm trying to do now. basically just unplug the power and monitor the gauges over here to see whether there's any drop in the pressure to determine if there's any leak in the CO2 regulator. Another tip that I have actually come across will be if you ever have a dual stage regulator like the Co2 Art over here, the recommended pressure for the output for a calcium reactor is 10 to 20 psi. And if you are from the freshwater side of the world, the recommended will be from 20 to 30 psi for your CO2 diffusers. So please keep that in mind and control the output. In terms of setting up my calcium reactor, I'm definitely going with this CO2 regulator over here. That's no doubt. If you're interested in getting this CO2 regulator by Co2 Art, feel free to use this promo code JzReefz and enjoy a 10% off for your purchase of this regulator. I've also read quite a fair bit, and I happened to chance upon a post by a person named JzReefz, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Pardon me if I'm wrong. He's a reefer just like you and me, posting in Reef to Reef forum. According to him, there's a linear reaction, a ratio, which I'm gonna coin it as the golden ratio he's sharing here, of 1:4. To simplify it, if you have 15 bubble counts per minute, that equals to a multiplier of 4, which equates to 60 ml of effluent flow rate per minute. I believe that is a very good ratio to follow, at least for a beginner like me, which a lot of calcium reactor users are not sharing online. So hopefully this helps you in terms of your calcium reactor setup. That being said, there are some reefers who have more corals than others, so this is a general guideline. Please do not take it as 100% must follow, but I believe the good 1:4 ratio will be a good start for everyone to follow through. He also did mention that a pH controller is definitely not a must. It might be a good to have in my opinion, but according to him, apparently the pH probe of most hobbyist controllers are not as accurate as we would like them to be. That being said, I'm still gonna go ahead and set up my pinpoint pH controller since I already got it, more as a redundancy in terms of if there's anything were to fail over here and I'm getting an absolutely crazy low pH, then I will have to cut off the CO2 power supply to prevent any further drop in pH. Given that the pH controller is an additional device, which means another point of potential failure, I could always rely on the 1:4 ratio in terms of dialing in. So in case the pH controller were to fail, the worst case scenario, it is gonna switch off the CO2 reactor and I'm gonna get a dip in my KH, which is gonna be detected by my KH Keeper Plus and notify me so that I can get my hands on to rectify whatever that is going on in the system. In the next video of my calcium reactor journey, I'll be unboxing and setting up the pH controller by pinpoint. I'll see you in the next video.